Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar inicio al seminario. Quisiera yo preguntar a quienes están transmitiendo a Cuernavaca si ya está transmitiéndose, si en Cuernavaca nos están escuchando. ¿Sí? Muy bien. So I'm going to start, voy a empezar en inglés, pero luego la presentación la haré en español. So first of all, I would like to thank Johan Rockstrom, Walter Willett, and 3 of the commissioners who will participate in this seminar. We really have a very tight schedule, and I really appreciate that you really made time to prepare your presentation. So I think that on behalf of the community of the National Public Health Institute, I would like to thank you for this. And if you allow me, I will give a very brief introduction in Spanish and then present you in Spanish, for the benefit of those that don't speak English very well. And most of our students understand English, so I think that it will be fine. So let me start by presenting this in Spanish. Bueno, quiero agradecerles a ustedes su presencia y a todo el grupo que está en Cuernavaca. Ustedes saben que la Comisión EAT-Lancet publicó un artículo en el 2019 que fue muy importante, ha sido muy importante en el mundo porque trajo el debate sobre la importancia de los sistemas alimentarios en la salud planetaria. Uno de los temas muy importantes es que lo que comemos, cómo lo producimos y cuánto desperdiciamos tiene impactos ambientales muy importantes, y si queremos evitar transgredir lo que llamamos los límites planetarios y tener un futuro promisorio para la humanidad, en donde nuestro planeta permita la habitabilidad para nuestra especie y otras especies, una manera de lograrlo es modificando lo que comemos, modificando cómo lo producimos y también cuánto desperdiciamos. Y ese fue verdaderamente el resumen, diría yo, muy rápido, de lo que publicamos en el 2019. La comisión sigue trabajando ahora con algunos miembros distintos al anterior y otros que continuamos, y ahora tenemos nuevos retos y van a platicarnos los 2 presidentes, los copresidentes del primer EAT-Lancet y que siguen siendo copresidentes de la segunda, que son el doctor Johan Rockstrom y el doctor Walter Willett. Nos van a hablar un poco de cuáles son los retos que estamos resolviendo en este EAT-Lancet 2. Entonces, sin más, voy ahora a presentar, va a presentar primero el doctor Rockstrom. So, Johan, you are going to be presenting first, if you agree, and I'm going to present you in Spanish. Johan es reconocido internacionalmente por su trabajo en el tema de sostenibilidad global. Es profesor en ciencias ambientales con énfasis en recursos hídricos y sostenibilidad global del Stockholm Resilience Center. Fue líder del equipo de científicos que presentó el marco sobre límites planetarios, publicado en el 2009, y que utilizamos en nuestro programa de salud planetaria como nuestro framework. El marco presenta nuevos límites que son fundamentales para mantener un espacio operativo seguro para la humanidad. Este marco no solamente ha sido adoptado por nosotros, por el Instituto, sino por varias ONGs, fundaciones, organismos internacionales. Johan ha sido asesor de organismos de Naciones Unidas, ha presentado conferencias en varios foros, en organizaciones gubernamentales y no gubernamentales, ha publicado más de 100 artículos de investigación, incluidos artículos en Science, en Nature, así como 20 libros, 20 capítulos de libro, y también ha publicado 4 libros que han tenido mucho éxito. Johan además participa, digamos, en varios, digamos, comunicaciones para el público, en Netflix, en varios escenarios, hablando precisamente sobre límites planetarios. Y entonces para nosotros es un gran honor, it's a great honor to have us here, Johan. So please, and so I will ask Johan and Walter to talk between 20 and maximum 25 minutes.
I might actually, if I can do, is it possible to do like this? Yes. So thanks, Juan, and it's a great pleasure. I'm speaking for Shakuntala, Walter, myself. What a pleasure it is to have the whole EAT-Lancet Commission here at the Institute for Public Health here in Mexico. And it's not a coincidence just that we're here. We're also here because Juan Rivera is such an active senior leader of the Commission's work. So we should thank you, Juan, for all the inputs and support for our scientific work that we are doing here. We're actually at the cutting edge of scientifically defining healthy diets from sustainable food systems, applying planetary health, which I know is a central topic to you, but also the whole planetary boundary science. And what I want to do now is to walk through with you the latest planetary boundary science, connected very much to the state of the climate crisis we're in, and then connect that to the food system transition. And I'll just say that right up front, that there are 2 big transitions that will determine the habitabilitat of the Earth system, which is the energy transition and the food system transition. So these are the decisive factors that will determine the livability on Earth for humanity. So therefore, the topic of today is really central. The healthy and sustainable food is fundamental for our future and for future generations on planet Earth. Any talk on planetary boundary science must start here today. That we, after 30 years of scientific advancement, of understanding all the human pressures on the planet, but also the functioning of the self-regulating, complex and adaptive Earth system, that we've now entered a whole new geological epoch. We're exiting the Holocene, where we've been for the past 12,000 years since we left the last ice age, and we entered the Anthropocene. Anthros, for us humans, where we are, the globalized modern world, the dominating force of change on planet Earth in terms of scale and speed and interconnectivity of change. This is just almost a mind-boggling step, which tells us that we're starting to hit the ceiling of the biophysical processes that regulates the state of the planet. Can you imagine? For the first time in human history, we have evidence that we humans are actually impacting the entire planet. We're putting the stability of the planet at risk. And this is the situation we're in. And that is why, of course, we need science to support our ability to come back into a safe space where we can maintain a manageable state of the planet. But taking this a bit from some of the indications of proof of this pressure, this, of course, is a curve that I'm sure that all of you have seen of temperature rise over the past 70 years. And we have 2023 over here, which is, as you know, with a 95% probability, heading towards being the warmest year ever on record. You should know that 2023 in the scientific community is described as a shock year. We've never seen the kind of deviations from the variability of temperatures in the ocean. We are seeing heat impacts, extreme events across the entire planet in ways that we've never measured before. And you see the September record here, 2023, almost 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. But what I want to have you observe here is that we have 3 super El Nino events over the past 25 years, 1998, 2016, and 2023. And these are natural variations. It's actually heat from the surface ocean released from the Pacific Oceans west of Peru into the atmosphere. We know that this creates extreme heat, but also extreme storms and droughts across the planet. But what is special is that they're occurring more frequently and that we are, as humans, reinforcing them. And we have scientific evidence of this. And that is where we are right now in 2023. Now, we also have an ecological crisis where we today have the evidence of being in or approaching the 6th mass extinction of species. We have documented that 2/3 of the populations of wildlife have been wiped out only since 1970s. So not only do we have a climate crisis, we have an ecological crisis where we're undermining the basis for all our human well-being, because we're losing pollinators, we're losing all the species that regulates water flow, we're losing large parts of the functions that keeps beautiful but very, very handy ecosystems for our economies intact. So that is the evidence we have. It's starting to hit us. We have from 2022 a bill of over $300 billion just from extreme events, which proven today to have been amplified by our global warming of climate. And this is just a little extract from what's happened over the past few months of 2023. And I just want to re-emphasize that. I think it's the first time we observe extreme events occurring simultaneously across the entire planet. From forest fires in Siberia, to fires in California, to heat waves in Europe, to floods in Southeast Asia. And this is now where we are. Now, what do we have to do? Well, one focus area is, of course, on climate, which I start with just to make the case why we need a planetary boundary approach. So this is the IPCC assessment of what we need to accomplish to be able to hold the global mean surface temperature at a manageable level of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase since we started the pre-industrial journey. You've all heard about the phasing out of coal, oil, and gas that we need to accomplish, bending the global curve of emissions by 2020, so already 3 years ago, cutting emissions by half every decade to reach a net zero world economy in less than 30 years. That's absolutely necessary. That's what we all are debating and being unable to deliver on. That's the big fights in the run-up to COP28. But what we tend to forget, that is not enough. We also need to transform the global food system from being the single largest emitter, 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, to become a major sink of greenhouse gases already within 30 years. Dear friends, that's an agricultural revolution. From increasing emissions from the food system to actually being a part of the solution. We have the technologies to do this, but it's a massive change and it's already factored into the models. It has to occur to hold the temperatures in a manageable level. But that's not enough. We also have to start scaling carbon capture and storage technologies, all forms of technologies to suck out carbon and plug in carbon removals in coal-fired plants, for example. But not even that is enough. We also need to keep nature intact, continuing to absorb 25% of carbon dioxide in intact forests, like the nature that you have been able to conserve in Mexico, and also 25% uptake in the ocean. So all of this needs to happen simultaneously for us to avoid unmanageable outcomes on climate. And this is just proof that what we're talking about is a sustainability transformation. It's not only about an energy transition, okay? Even if you only focus on climate, you need a planetary boundary approach. Now, unfortunately, we're heading towards a temperature level of 2.7 degrees Celsius, even if all the nationally determined contributions are implemented. So all the plans that all the countries in the world have agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, even if they were implemented, we are following a pathway that would take us, and I'll be very clear with you here, to disaster. There's no hesitation here scientifically anymore. Actually, over the past 3 million years, we never passed 2 degrees. 3 million years. If we would go to 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, in less than 80 years' time, it's like winding back the climate clock 4 million years. It's outside of the Quaternary. Quaternary is the 3 million years of planet Earth's geological journey when planet Earth has resembled our planet as we know it today, with a carbon cycle, a water cycle, the continents in the place we know, oxygen levels. The planet we know is the planet of the Quaternary. You go outside of that, you end up in dinosaur land, okay? So basically, we don't want to go there. This is a path that we cannot accept. The window is still open to avoid it, but it's just kind of pointing at why is scientists today raising the language towards using conclusions like a planetary emergency. Well, it's this. It is that we are coming too close to losing the possibilities of holding manageable outcomes. Is it me just talking? Well, actually, no. This is now the summary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC 6th assessment. I'm taking out what I would argue to be the 3 highest level conclusions in the 6th assessment. One is, it's clear we're causing global warming. Number 2, we're threatening the stability of the planet. Never before has the IPCC been forced to say that. But they're basically aligning themselves with the planetary boundary science. We're now putting the stability of the planet at risk. And not only that, the IPCC now confirms that it won't be enough to just phase out fossil fuels. We have to keep up to 50% of nature intact. That, dear friends, is biodiversity, land, fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus, air pollutants. It is a holistic pathway to a safe landing set by the IPCC, the consensus in the climate community. That is really important. It means that we really need to be stewards of the entire planet. Irrespective of where you live on planet Earth, that's the reality. We now are so interconnected that we now need to take care of the whole system. Just to hammer home that message, which is, to me, more than science. Now I'm kind of entering what in my life at least, takes me down at the stomach level, because, and it comes from geological data. This is ice core data, our journey on planet Earth over the past 20,000 years. Here's global mean surface temperature. The 0 line is 14 degrees Celsius, before we start burning fossil fuels. -6 degrees, deep ice age. We leave the last ice age some 16,000 years ago, and then we come into this extraordinarily stable, just look at that line, 10,000 years of extraordinary stability, 14 degrees Celsius, plus minus 0.5. That's the Holocene. We have, as modern humans, lived on planet Earth for 200,000 years. We've lived through 2 ice ages and 2 interglacials. This is an interglacial, the Holocene. We were a few million people. We were hunters and gatherers. We lived in caves. We were having a rough time. Very large variability in the environmental conditions on planet Earth, until we leave the last ice age and we come into this extraordinarily stable state, and we're just 10,000 years back. And basically, in this part of the world, as one of the big Neolithic revolutions, we transition from hunters and gatherers to becoming farmers. The big agricultural revolution takes off. Why? Because the planet is so stable. And off we go in the civilizational journey as we know it, and now we're leaving the Holocene into the Anthropocene. This is proof, not only that we're in danger because we're in the Anthropocene, but also that we have a reference point of the desired planet, the planet that can support us, humanity, the Holocene. And this is extraordinary because we know so much about the Holocene. We understand the carbon cycle, the temperatures. We have data on the hydrological cycle. So we can measure against the Holocene when we define the safe space with planetary boundaries. But not only that, the question is, of course, why did the planet stay within this very stable state? We have the proof that the reason for this is not that external forcings were so gentle, that the sun was simply just having one very gentle variability on its insolation, radiation on the planet Earth. Oh no, it was to a large extent, actually roughly 2/3 of the explanation why the planet stayed so stable is from the inbuilt resilience of the planet. And here is the proof. This is the global carbon budget coming out each year, showing over the last 150 years how we burn fossil fuels and emit more and more carbon, releasing it to the atmosphere, cutting down trees. Is it all of this that has caused the warming so far? The answer is no, because the oceans has taken up 25% and land-based ecosystems another 25%. So it's only this blue part that has remained in the atmosphere causing the warming so far. And even a child looking at this graph will tell you, the more we we punish the planet, the more she seems to be helping us. And this is correct. A resilient, healthy planet has the ability to buffer stress. That is resilience. And this is what the planet has been helping us with for the past 150 years, hiding under the carpet our climate debt. This is the biggest subsidy to the world economy. 50% of our climate debt is in the ocean and in the trees in intact nature. Okay? So this is a proof that the planet, in a good state, tries to stay in the Holocene. But this is just the carbon story. This is what the ocean has done for us in terms of heat. Did you know that 91% of the heat caused by our fossil fuel burning is not in the atmosphere? It's in the ocean. And here are the measurements. Look at this curve of the increase of heat uptake is in the ocean. Is it surprising that we get reinforced El Niño events? Of course not. This is exactly what you expect. More fierce hurricanes, typhoons, more rainfall on planet Earth. 7% more moisture in the atmosphere for every 1 degree Celsius warming because of the warmth and heat in the ocean. So this is a stress response, but a healthy planet is able to do it because it tries to apply its biogeochemical processes to stay within the Holocene. We need to define that safe space to have a chance. Now, what we use scientifically to define that space is therefore measuring the Holocene, but also we want to avoid crossing tipping points. And I'll just give you one example of that scientific update, showing that 1.5 degrees Celsius is an example of a safe boundary level. So here is the map over the 16 tipping point systems that we now scientifically know regulates the stability of the climate system, and they have multiple stable states. Push them too far, and they cross a tipping point. So the Amazon rainforest, for example, which provides the whole planet with stable carbon sinks and moisture feedback, can tip over into becoming a savanna system, releasing that carbon. The breakthrough with this work are the colors here, and the red dots are those that are likely to cross their tipping point already at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you have them in this graph, which shows the uncertainty range in science. The darker the red, the higher the precision in science. Here you have 1.5 degrees Celsius, and look just at these 5 here, which are likely to cross their tipping points already at 1.5. And you have the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, all the tropical coral reef systems, abrupt thawing of permafrost, and losing the Barents Sea ice. Just these 2 ice sheets are 10 meters sea level rise. So this is the kind of science we use to provide humanity with these safe boundaries, because you don't want this to happen, because these are global commons. These are functions that we all depend on. We cannot allow them to cross their thresholds. So we set the boundary below, slightly below that 1.5 level. I'm just sharing you the methodologies we're using to define the boundaries. Again, is it only a scientific group kind of bringing this forward? Oh no, the IPCC has also a table listing all these climate tipping element systems. They're now in the mainstream. In fact, over the last 5 IPCC assessments, the risk of crossing tipping points has gone from 6 degrees Celsius down to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So we are being confirmed also in the broad mainstream of climate science. That's very reassuring. But being in Mexico, in a very ecosystem-rich forest country, I just want to share with you also that we have criticism of our own research, because you didn't see it because I went through it very quickly. But the Amazon rainforest, the climate science, assesses that the risk of crossing a tipping point isn't until 3 degrees Celsius of warming. So basically a very climate robust biome. But leading ecologists in the world, the late Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobres from Brazil, criticizes this because they say that the Amazon rainforest will tip much earlier into a savanna state because of deforestation. So, as I'm sure you're much more kind of aware of, is it's not only climate change, it's also about ecological change. And when these things interact, warming, causing fires and droughts and deforestation, you are, of course, risk of crossing tipping points much earlier than we had originally thought. And then finally, before just closing with the planetary boundary science update, just to show that the implications for us as humans can be very dire. This is an assessment of what can happen in just 50 years' time in terms of the percentage of people in these dashed lines living in regions that are above the health levels on heat. And what you see here, just look at the map here, large parts of Brazil, West Africa, Horn of Africa, the whole of India, being basically threatening the human health levels just on heat. Here are the regions that are water scarce in terms of continued climate change. So we have a very unfortunate synchronization of threats if you continue the business as usual pathway, which of course is a recipe for social instability. So that is something that we're increasingly studying. So that's why we need to come to a point of setting safe boundaries for humanity. We're in the Anthropocene. We know the Holocene is our desired state, and tipping points are hardwired, and we need to avoid them. We've been studying this for now 15 years, identifying the 9 boundary systems that we have scientific evidence that they regulate the state and livability of life support on Earth. It's not only climate, it is, as I've been saying now very clearly, also nature, biodiversity, the configuration of biomes, fresh water, and the cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus. It's also the stratospheric ozone layer, chemicals, air pollutants, and of course, a stable ocean. So there you have them, the 9 systems. We've been quantifying these in different scientific updates. This was published just a month ago. We've now been able to quantify all the 9 boundaries. And unfortunately, which is verified by what we're seeing out in the real world, 6 of the 9 boundaries are outside of their safe space. So it's not only climate, it's also the risk of losing the resilience in the other boundaries. And these are equally important to work on. As I said, we've been advancing this for a long time. This is the 2015 second update, where we concluded that only 4 of the 9 boundaries were outside of the safe space. Now we conclude that 6 of the 9 are outside. This is partly because we're advancing in science and being able to quantify more boundaries, but it's also that we continue to moving in the wrong direction. So unfortunately, the message is we've not turned this around yet. We're still moving in a pathway towards increasing danger. So the EAT-Lancet Commission has really been trying to address the food system dimension of this whole challenge. And what we find, which is also, I'm sure, no surprise to you, is that when you quantify the role of food behind the transgression, the breaching of the boundaries, you find that food is the single largest cause why we are outside of the safe space. Because not only is food the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, it's also the major cause behind loss of biodiversity. It's of course the reason why we're expanding land into nature across the world. It's the #1 consumer of fresh water, and it's also the prime user of reactive nitrogen and phosphorus through fertilizers. So basically, to put it very simple, we fixed the food system, we've actually come a long way to fix the planet. And this is one of the key excitements why we want to quantify the safe food-related planetary boundaries. We've done that in the first EAT-Lancet Commission work that was published in 2019, with quantifications across a significant number of the planetary boundaries, so safe levels for different boundaries, and then running scenarios of how can we go back. And I won't go through all this together, just to hammer home the key messages. If we continue producing food as today, with 30% food waste, in unsustainable production, eating unhealthy diets, we remain in the red. We will just continue moving in outside. Even if we decarbonize the energy system, we would still be in the red. Just by eating unhealthy food, by producing food in conventional, unsustainable way, and losing 30% in food waste. But if we would adopt healthy diets, the planetary health diet that Walt will be presenting just now, cutting in waste by half and producing food with sustainable practices that we know are existing and can be scaled, we would essentially be bringing ourselves back into all these boundaries. So there is a critical story of risk, but it's also a critical story of a window for a transition. And we've been studying this. We show that if we produce food as today and only care about planetary boundaries, we could only feed 6 billion people. But if we transition and invest in all the practices we know, we at least, in the work that Dieter Gerten and colleagues at the Potsdam Institute have been doing, conclude that we can even feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries. And we have also more and more evidence that sustainable intensification is possible, that 29% of farmers across the world have actually started transformations towards better sustainable practices. So it's not as if we're standing and starting from zero. In Africa, we know we need a triply green revolution where we increase production, yes, but we also need sustainability, and it must be based on helping small-scale rain-fed farmers to move up the ladder of development. And we have so much evidence of how zero-tillage systems can provide much more moisture holding capacity, which compared to systems that are outside and using conventional systems, even though it takes a long time to build up that water holding capacity, we actually have systems that can build that resilience in the systems. So to close, to also just finally say that policy is catching up with science. The CBD, the big global biodiversity framework adopted in Montreal and Kunming just last year, actually now provides very strong support in line with the planetary boundaries. We need to halt the loss of biodiversity by 2030. This is actually meaning zero loss of nature's capacity to deliver stable conditions. So we have now quantifications, not only on climate, but also on biodiversity in terms of planetary boundaries in the policy space, that we need to move towards a more positive rebuilding capacities in nature over the next decades. The Earth Commission has recently published work on justice, not across all planetary boundaries, but actually looking at what do the just levels for the safe operating space mean. So that is something we in the EAT-Lancet Commission now will also be working on, the justice dimensions of how do we reduce significant harm to people. I just want to mention that that means that the safe space may shrink even further if we want to really care about impacts on people. And I'll leave you with this slide, which is that now we need to really recognize that however we define our desired future, here just illustrated through the Sustainable Development Goals, they have to be delivered within a resilient and stable planet. That's where we reach to, and that's what we now need to accomplish. And with that, we hand over to the healthy part of this seminar, and thanks for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. This was a great presentation, and of course, paso al español. Desde luego, creo que todos estamos muy preocupados. Realmente estamos sobrepasando los límites planetarios. Es un desastre, como lo dijo Johan, pero también hay un lado esperanzador, y por esa razón creamos en el instituto el programa de salud planetaria, y estamos trabajando en eso, y creo que esta es una razón de más, estará de acuerdo conmigo Horacio, para invitar a todo mundo a que colaboren con este programa. Y ahora tengo el gusto de presentar al doctor Walter Willett, quien es profesor de Epidemiología y Nutrición de la Escuela Chan de Salud Pública de Harvard. Desde 1980 ha desarrollado los estudios de cohorte de enfermeras y profesionales de la salud que todos aquí conocemos. En conjunto, estas cohortes estudian a casi 300,000 personas con evaluaciones dietéticas repetidas y también mediciones de diferentes variables de desenlace en salud. El doctor Willett es muy productivo. Creo que la persona más productiva en el campo de la nutrición, la persona más citada. Y ha publicado también su libro de texto que muchos hemos utilizado, y ha escrito también libros para el público en general. Él es miembro de la Academia de Medicina y Ciencias y ha recibido muchos premios, y está estrechamente ligado al INSP, porque Walter ha sido el director de tesis de dos directores generales, de Jaime y de Mauricio, y también de Rui y de Martín, y actualmente tiene 2 estudiantes nuestros allá, le dio clases también a Bernardo. En fin, Walter está vinculado, el estudio de ESMAESTRAS, desde luego Walter ha sido una inspiración para eso, lo conocemos mucho, y pues es un gusto, Walter, que estés aquí.
Gracias, Juan. I need to come back for a longer time and bring my Spanish back up to speed. So excuse me, I'll speak in English. And it has been a real important part of my career, starting off as a medical student to spend a summer in Tlaxcala before the nutrition transition. That was in the 1960s, when undernutrition and childhood mortality were the major causes of death, and really see before my eyes huge advances, and so maybe 90% reduction in childhood mortality. Mexico has accomplished, huge accomplishment. But now, well, visualizing and seeing Julio Frank build INSP out there in the wilderness when it was almost by itself out in the field, and now it's become one of the leading public health institutions in the world. But at the same time, like most of the world, being engulfed with an epidemic of NCDs, most conspicuously early on, obesity and diabetes, but we know there's a lot to follow from that. So it's really tremendous to be working with today and along the years, as Juan has described, with some fantastic students who have gone on to do amazing things that I could never imagine doing myself. So I'm really honored to be here today. And I'm going to go back a little over 5 years to where we were starting the first EAT-Lancet Commission. We were given the challenge, how can we feed what will be close to 10 billion people by 2050, a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. And as Johan clearly talked about already at that time, we were very worried about the time trends and climate change, and most important, just the fundamental point that this is not linear, it's accelerating. And since that time, we've seen even more acceleration right up until this year, as Johan described. And again, making the point that Johan made, that the first, probably the biggest thing we need to do is get off of fossil fuels as fast as we can. But if we do that, it's not going to be enough. And that black line there is the business as usual model, staying with our current diets in the affluent countries, but adding another 2.5 billion people who will eat more and more meat, as FAO predicts, that will make it impossible. We could see even at that time to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade either. So clearly we need to focus on our diets and the food system that is contributing to the problems. And that green issue there, green part of the figure there, this is an old IPCC figure showing basically the negative emissions that need to occur and counting a lot on the food systems to provide some of that. So we had this daunting task before us, and spent a few months trying to figure out how are we going to take on such a complicated problem. And ultimately, we decided to break it down into 4 steps. This wasn't the only way to look at it, but for multiple reasons, this is what we decided to do, was first of all, define a healthy reference diet using the best available evidence of all types, from controlled feeding studies, long-term cohort studies, and randomized trials where we had such information. And I'm going to talk mostly about that because Johan has talked about defining planetary boundaries and then really looking at the question, could we stay within planetary boundaries while at the same time providing a healthy diet for 10 billion people? And then we looked at some strategies, which I'm not going to talk about today. Ultimately, we came up with what we call Table 1 in our report, our reference diet. We at that time said 2,500 kilocalories a day. That's taking into account the fact that we would hope that people would be a little bit more physically active than they are today, and that we need to accommodate some an almost inevitable mismatching of what's available and what specific needs are. The best estimates there, the current consumption was about 2,400 kilocalories a day. Maybe it looks like we maybe with some more new data be able to decrease that a little bit. But the diet here, I don't have time to go through all the numbers. Essentially, it emphasizes an adequate amount of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, what amounts to about 1 serving or 1 glass of milk a day or cheese equivalents, and then 14 grams a day of red meat from beef, pork, or lamb. And that comes out to about 1 hamburger per week, or if you want to have big steak, about once a month. And I'll come back and talk about that as an example in more detail. with some modest amounts of poultry and eggs and fish, but emphasizing plant protein sources such as legumes, soy, and nuts, and then unsaturated healthy fats, minimal saturated fats, and keeping sugar relatively low. That's a lot of numbers, but it actually, in the end, I realized after our report, it boils down to something really pretty simple that I find very easy to follow, and that's 1 + 1. And most people can figure out that that means 2, and that's 2 servings of animal sources of protein a day, with one of them being dairy, and then the other one being some mix over a week of fish and poultry, red meat, with the red meat being about 1 of those servings per week. And that provides a huge amount of variety and options and ways to put that together. And it's on a base of, again, nuts, soybeans, fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and healthy plant oils. But it's actually, I think, keep in mind, this is not a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, not even close to it. And it's consistent with many traditional diets around the world. But that issue around red meat has become controversial, even though, in fact, it's not radical if you look at what most of the world is eating, but it would be a big change, about a 2/3 reduction from what's consumed in the United States and even almost in Mexico now, and Brazil, and China. China's about equal to the US in red meat consumption now. So for some parts of the world, it would be an important decrease. But this is, for example, a report of the FAO that was issued just a few months ago that said consuming unprocessed red meat in moderate amounts ranging from 9 to 71 grams per day may have minimal risk, but is considered safe with regards to chronic disease outcomes. Now, where they got that conclusion, if you look at the several hundred-page report, there's no basis for that conclusion at all. It seems to have come out of thin air. So this is indeed a controversial topic, powerful economic interests at stake, of course. So how did we look at this? Look at the data, look at the evidence, and come to about 14 grams a day, realizing that that's not an exact number, it's an approximate number. First of all, we looked at the composition of different major protein sources, and specifically the polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio, which we've known for 50 years is important, that's related to lower cholesterol levels, an important risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So just looking at this one part of the composition of red meat, beef is very low. There's not much polyunsaturated fat there. People more focus on the saturated fat, not the healthy unsaturated fat. Pork's a little bit better, chicken better than that, salmon better, but if you really want to go to high PS ratios, you need to go to plant protein sources like nuts and soy products and lentils. Then we looked at as another level of evidence, we looked at randomized trials, looking at different foods and how they predict risk factors. Here, LDL cholesterol, again, a very important risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And here, the important point I wanted to emphasize, and I think in nutrition, people understand substitution, and what you substitute for any one food is always extremely important. In fact, maybe as important or more important than the food you're talking about. So if we're reducing red meat, well, what are we going to replace it with? And that makes a huge difference. So on the right side, if we replace red meat with the usual diet, which isn't very healthy, then there's not much difference in LDL cholesterol. Or if you replace it with other animal protein sources, not much difference. But if you have red meat compared to high quality plant proteins, such as legumes, soy, and nuts, then red meat elevates LDL cholesterol. No big surprise given the composition of it, but this is another important layer of evidence to support causality, because the reality is we'll probably never have randomized trials assigning people to red meat or soy and follow them for decades to see what happens to cardiovascular disease. It's just not going to happen. Same in climate change. You can't do randomized trials. How many planets do you need to randomize? It doesn't work. So we will have observational studies, but looking at causality with intermediate risk factors is therefore very important. I know you can't see the details here, but this is a summary of cohort studies looking at different components of the diet including red meat, in relation to various outcomes. This was published by the Tufts group last year, and there was strong evidence from cohort studies of causality relating red meat, unprocessed red meat consumption to cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. So again, the whole body of evidence, layers of evidence pointing to a causal relationship. We've looked at this in our large cohort studies that Dr. Rivera mentioned, and just very briefly for those not familiar with our cohort studies, we have 3 large cohorts, actually a 4th that's now underway, but the first was a nurses' health study starting in 1976 and starting with dietary collection 1980. And what's unique is that we do update that information every 4 years on diet as we go along, so we can track diets and then how that's related to incidence of virtually all major health outcomes. That was only women in the original nurses' health study of 121,000 people. We added 52,000 men in 1986, and then the next generation younger cohort of nurses' health study 2 in 1989. So we're tracking all these people over time, tracking their diets and then tracking health outcomes, so we can adjust for smoking, physical activity, other potentially confounding factors that might distort the diet and health relationships. So just as one example, this is looking at a relationship between major protein sources and all-cause mortality over about 3 decades for an equivalent amount of protein, 3% of energy from protein from these different sources. This is about 30,000 participants had died during this period. Here the comparison is dairy consumption, and we can see that at the top, the worst protein source was processed red meat, and then eggs, then unprocessed red meat, worse than dairy, and then fish and poultry, pretty similar to dairy, but if you really wanted to go to low mortality, it would emphasize plant protein sources. So that, again, that consistency of kinds of evidence from the long-term cohort studies, the randomized trials looking at intermediate factors and the composition really does make the case for causality. But it's not enough to know just that, say, red meat is causally related to not NCD risk. The question is how much, and that gets a little more complicated. And for that, we use diabetes as the outcome variable because, as I think most of you know, diabetes is sort of a red flag in the nutrition transition, or just as on an individual basis, that first we develop obesity, then we develop diabetes, then we develop renal failure, blindness, amputation, coronary heart disease, all that follows along. So this is not, and that's what we see happening in Mexico or Asia, that obesity, a lot of diabetes, and then we know there's a lot that's going to follow on beyond that. So this is an important endpoint to look at, and it's also in some ways less complicated than other endpoints. So this is looking at about 25 years of follow-up, over 13,000 participants who developed type 2 diabetes. And this is the dose-response relationship between red meat consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes. And it's basically a linear relationship. And then we're stuck with a problem. Where do you draw a line? That's always a question where we have linear, pretty monotonic associations. And it's always going to be a bit arbitrary where you draw the line. But at the second quintile, right here, there's already a significant, modest but significant increase in risk of type 2 diabetes. And so we said, well, we don't want to recommend that significant increase, even though it's fairly modest. We took the midpoint there, which does turn out to be about 14 grams a week of red meat. Now you can argue it should be a little bit less, should be a little bit more, but if you want to keep diabetes risk low, that would be, you'd want to be at that number or less. So we've updated that for the second report that we're working on. Now this is with additional 5 years of follow-up. There's over 23,000 incident cases of type 2 diabetes. So the big numbers gives us precision around the different doses. And it's basically the same relationship. This is looking at total red meat, that's processed red meat, and that's looking at unprocessed red meat. And again, pretty monotonic linear relationships. And actually the numbers come out, you can't see them. It comes out to using the same argument that already by the second level of intake, there's a significant increase that taking half of that comes out to about 11 grams of protein of red meat per day. So it reinforces the what we found earlier. And we've done some methodologic work at this. This was using the repeated measures, which is fairly unique, that most cohort studies just have one measure and then years of follow-up. And obviously people change their diets. They don't stay on that same track all the time. So we found it's quite important to have that updating. And here, this line, the red is looking at what we would see if we only had the baseline measurement. And this is where we have the what we call cumulative average of all the measurements of red meat consumption. So we would miss about half the excess risk if we only had baseline measurements of diabetes. And then we've gone on to take into account the fact that we don't measure anything perfectly. Nothing in life is measured perfectly, and certainly diet isn't measured perfectly. So we've done very detailed studies in a subset of our population of about 1,300 participants, collecting very detailed dietary data with weighed diet records for 14 days over a year. And then we can use that to calibrate our food frequency questionnaire, and using some statistical methods I won't go into now. If we count, this is what we see, what I showed before, the cumulative average. But if we account for the measurement error, then we again have about a 50%, another 50% increase in risk that we would expect to see if we had perfect measurements. It's a statistical correction there. But we've also then looked at, subsequent to the last report, what would be the health benefits of adhering to this healthy dietary pattern that we described. And so we created a score for adherence to what we call planetary health diet. And this is a paper we've just submitted based on, again, combining our cohorts. And we have 54,000 participants have died by this time. And so again, there's a lot of statistical precision. This is looking across deciles. This is in women, about a 30% lower risk of death with higher adherence to the planetary health dietary pattern, and men basically the same relationship, just a little bit of deviation from linearity, but basically about a 30% lower risk, again, for full, for best adherence, not 100% adherence. So that's just a taste of what we're doing in terms of analyses for updating the planetary health dietary pattern. We're taking into account, as we are working now in EAT-Lancet 2.0, updating again the science between diet and health and planetary boundaries that Dr. Rockstrom is leading. One issue that had been raised is this dietary pattern applicable to the world? Were we overgeneralizing it? So we're developing examples of how this can be applied to pretty much every population of the world. And I'll come back to that. We're definitely expanding the section on what's been called nature positive or regenerative agriculture, and or I think we're going to use sustainable intensification, but that dealing with that negative carbon emissions that we have to grapple with. We're adding an important section on food justice within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, and then developing further the translational section to include food justice as well as the outcomes we were looking at before. And just to, again, make the point that we can't say people should reduce or increase anything, because it depends on the starting point. And the starting point is hugely different depending on where we live in the world. That red meat consumption is, where this is our planetary health reference number, red meat consumption in North America is way over that number, but in Southeast Asia, it's about half of that. For sub-Saharan Africa, just about on that target number. But again, within Africa and within populations, there's huge distribution variability as well. But pretty much all parts of the world would benefit by more fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. So just as some examples here that we're developing, and we're going to be developing a lot more. This is what a planetary health diet would look like for Vietnam. We didn't have to change much from a traditional, what's being consumed now in Vietnam. Well, it might have been consumed 20 years ago in Vietnam. It's changed, but except we did emphasize brown rice instead of white rice. So the white rice is a serious issue, and the amounts consumed across a lot of Asia there. This is a West African way of putting together a healthy and sustainable diet. This is from Costa Rica. My colleague Anya Campos put this together, which probably looks pretty familiar to people here in Mexico as well. A lot of the traditional foods being similar here. But the basic point is that we can put this dietary pattern together with the foods and flavors from cultures all over the world. And actually, many traditional diets are quite close to this pattern already. So it wouldn't involve major changes. But things are happening now. And I think most of us are concerned, literally, our world is going up in flames for our children and our grandchildren. And as Dr. Rockstrom had mentioned, it looks like the Amazon is close to becoming a net carbon emitter, not a carbon sink at this point in time. And a lot of it's basically being driven by our red meat consumption. It's not just the cattle grazing there on the space that was deforested, but a lot of it is in the form of soy production and other grain production that's fed to cattle around the world, not just in the Amazon. So to conclude, for health, limiting red meat to about 1 serving a week or less and consuming mainly plant protein alternatives will be optimal. For health, some production of red meat without the use of fossil fuels is potentially sustainable, but resource use in general would favor using, where we do have cattle, dairy or pork production has somewhat less of a footprint as well. But we're currently exceeding sustainable planetary boundaries, and you don't need statistics. You just look around the world and see what's happening. We're badly off track right now, and the pathway shows us, again, adding several billion people and consuming more of unhealthy and unsustainable foods. So the urgency of making changes, I think, is undeniable, even without the statistics and that Johannes described in great detail, the dangers of crossing planetary boundaries. And I think it's a little bit sobering that beef, soy, corn, grains are all international commodities. So it doesn't matter when we eat red meat, whether it was produced in the Amazon or whether it was produced in Nebraska or Argentina. These are all big pools, and the demand incorporates all of these pools. So one of the most important things we can do is to reduce red meat consumption or limit red meat consumption in places, again, we don't have to reduce it. It depends where we start from. But that's only one step in what we have to do. In the end, though we did see there was a positive pathway forward in terms of changing our diets, reducing food waste, food loss, and improving agricultural production methods. But it's going to be a big step, a huge challenge to do that. It's going to require almost everyone's input and energy to make that actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. It was a great presentation. And so I'm going to ask our colleagues les voy a pedir que por favor suban las 5 sillas aquí y mientras yo presento. So we are going to ask 3 of our commissioners to come here to the front, and also Johan and Walter, because at this point, our three commissioners will provide comments briefly, so altogether not to exceed about 15 minutes so that we can have some time for general questions. So while they are coming to the podium, I'm going to present them. Pueden pasar, can you please come to the podium? Mientras vienen, voy a presentarlas en español y quisiera yo presentar primero a la doctora Shakuntala Tilshed, quien está aquí a mi lado, que es una de las copresidentas de la comisión junto con Walter y con Johan. Así que la doctora Shakuntala es otra de las líderes. Ella es líder global de nutrición y salud pública en World Fish, que es un centro de investigación global de CGIAR. Y ella recibió en el 2021 el Premio Mundial de Alimentación por su investigación en el desarrollo de enfoques sensibles a la nutrición para los sistemas alimentarios. Very nice to have you here, Shakuntala. Voy a presentar también al lado de Shakuntala a la doctora Cristina Hicks, quien es profesora del Grupo de Ecología Política del Centro Ambiental de la Universidad de Lancaster y está interesada en las relaciones que los individuos y las sociedades forman con la naturaleza y los resultados sociales, ambientales y de salud que resultan de estas relaciones. Y ella ha estado trabajando dentro del grupo en el tema de justicia y creo que nos va a hablar sobre eso. Y finalmente la doctora Line Gordon, que es quien sigue. Ella es líder de uno de los grupos de trabajo, que es el grupo de transformación, porque EAT-Lancet propone que si transformamos el sistema, podemos llegar a esos límites. Y ella está trabajando precisamente en el tema de transformación. Line es directora del Centro de Resiliencia de Estocolmo. Es una científica reconocida en sostenibilidad del agua, alimentos y biosfera. Y sus investigaciones combinan tanto el trabajo con pequeños agricultores en África, como modelos globales de interacciones entre el uso de la tierra y las precipitaciones e innovaciones culinarias. Muy bien, entonces ahora vamos a pasar a los breves comentarios. So I will start with Shakuntala, please. You want to do it from there? Yes.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here with you. So you've heard from my two colleagues, Johan and Walter, why it is imperative that we move to a sustainable, healthy diet, and that we have a transformation that does so in a just manner. And I will now try to put this in a global perspective and to end by asking you to think about what you, in your positions and being students, what you can do to be engaged in the transformation of food systems in a just manner and making sure that no one is left behind. So I'll do this from a global perspective. You all, I'm sure, know about the 17 Sustainable Goals that we all countries, and we all have signed on to. Meeting these 17 Sustainable Goals by 2030, which now can be an issue, especially with the setbacks and disruptions we have had with COVID-19, then with all the effects we are seeing of climate, and also recently, and not just recently, but in recent times, with the wars in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the hikes in prices of food, fuel, and fertilizer. So we have this goal of the 17 Sustainable Goals to meet, and we also have set a date by 2030, and we all are working quite hard to making sure that we get there fast, even though meeting the deadline of 2030 can be difficult. In doing so, the United Nations have taken a number of steps to ensure that everyone is engaged and that we move together to get there. The EAT-Lancet 2.0 report will be an extremely important contribution to this transformation of food systems to be just and transformative, ensuring that we reach the healthy people and healthy planet. So the science and the innovations and the recommendations that would stem from EAT-Lancet 2.0 will feeding to this global agenda. This global agenda, in order that actions can be taken, must be translated into national pathways. And Mexico has signed up to this to the 17 development goals and has also begun working on the national pathway with having together a national convener and a government that is closely related to the transformation that's happening in the UN systems and is dedicated to meeting these goals and ensuring that the transformation of food systems take place and that no one is left behind, and that it's a sustainable and healthy diets for all in a just manner. Reaching there, the UN has held the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, which I'm sure most of you all have heard about, and also moving forward to 2030. The UN has recently held a meeting 2 months ago at FAO in Rome, where countries have signed on and have committed to writing their national pathways for transformation of food systems, ensuring that they are sustainable and healthy, leaving no one behind, and thereby being just. At the UN, after the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, the meeting that was held a few months ago, the Mexican government provided the pathway, the national pathway that they would move forward with in ensuring this transformation of food systems. So there is already at country level a plan for how we move forward. And then I'll end by saying, what can you do? So within these systems, within the United Nations, there are different groups that are engaged in the different seminars, meetings that are being held. And within each group, there is also a youth group. So for example, with respect to taking care and making sure that indigenous peoples' diets and geographies are taken into consideration, making sure that the transformation is just and leaving no one behind. There are very strong youth groups working at different levels. And within Mexico, there are very strong youth groups, also indigenous youth groups, working together with different at different parts of the systems within the UN and within the governments to get engaged. So I would leave you with, look at what's happening, read what's happening, look at the changes that Mexico wants to make through its national pathway, get in contact with the groups around the national conveners for the transformation of food systems, get to the leaders of the youth group and get engaged and ensure that Mexico and you play an important role in this transformation of food systems that will benefit all people, all nations, not just Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shakuntala. That was a very, very important comment, calling our community to action and to see, what can we do. So now, please, Christina, can you provide your comment?
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting us here this week and for giving us the opportunity to talk to you all. I think what Shakuntala has highlighted and what Johan and Walt's talks underscored is the fact that both the threats from Earth system change and the risks from unhealthy diets are distributed unequally around the world. Certain peoples, both within countries, but also across the world, are impacted worse. Lower socioeconomic neighborhoods or lower income nations find it harder to secure access to healthy and sustainable food. So this means that any transition towards more healthy and sustainable food systems can be a really good and strong reason to support justice. But it's not a given. Adopting healthy diets, as I mentioned at the start, is easier for some people. Wealthier neighborhoods, for example, often have more healthy foods accessible to them. So as we, as a global community and within the Commission, think about transitioning towards healthy and sustainable systems, we need to pay attention to these differences. We need to make sure that the most vulnerable are also able to participate equally in this transition. Furthermore, if we move with the urgency needed towards healthy and sustainable systems without paying attention to injustices, we may create or exacerbate these injustices. So it's for this reason that EAT-Lancet 2.0 has added justice as one of the core components to complement the healthy and sustainable diets. And in it, we're asking questions such as who is most harmed by unhealthy food systems, who is most at risk of climate impacts, and who's responsible. We're exploring what are the current food system injustices? Who is it that lacks access to food, to decent work opportunities, and to pollution-free environments? Who controls the food system? And who decides what gets to be grown and sold, where, and for how much? And in exploring these questions, what we set out to do, one of the things that we're setting out to do is adding to the planetary boundaries, something that we're referring to, and Johan talked about, is this idea of what would be comparable justice boundaries or justice guardrails that are designed to protect everyone as we transition, and especially, again, the most vulnerable in society. So these are minimums below which we don't want to fall, that relate to food, to working conditions, to environmental conditions. Unfortunately, like the planetary boundaries, it looks like we're already under a number of these. So we do have our work set out for us, but I don't think we're alone in this mission. I'll hand it over to Lina for the transformations.
Thank you, Christina. That was very, very important to recognize the dimension that in the first report was not addressed. But thank you. Lina?
Thanks a lot for having me here. And I think after the talks that you've heard now, there's we're all convinced, right, that there is a massive challenge that we're facing, and that nothing less than a big food system transformation is required. In EAT-Lancet 1, we looked at especially at 4 key areas of transformative change that are needed, and it was aligning commitments on national and international levels towards a healthy diet. So shifting the diet is fundamental. The second part had to do with agricultural priorities, that we have focused so much on just increasing the quantity of food, not enough on increasing the quality of food. So really redirecting agricultural subsidies into what is actually producing healthy food items. We also emphasize the need for sustainable intensification of food systems. The third part was cutting food loss and waste. And I think that has also been emphasized, I mean, throughout many different things that have come out also through after EAT-Lancet 1, but with another emphasis currently on how do we move to more circular food systems so that we also can use byproducts into our food system. And then the fourth part emphasis was the coordination of land and ocean system that we at the same time need to protect and manage the ecosystems that we are so dependent upon also outside of agriculture. As Christina was mentioning, we're now really trying to integrate justice into EAT-Lancet 2.0 and revisiting the kind of key messages in terms of how can we ensure that justice is part of the food transformation moving forward. I think a lot of the work that, if you look at what's happened since EAT-Lancet came out, has emphasized that we all agree on this global scale of the challenge, but that the pathways to reach these goals will look very different in different places around the world. We work quite a lot in Sweden on what would be the Swedish pathway to reach joint goals on climate, biodiversity, and health. It's quite interesting, actually, when I look into the scientific literature on sort of national efforts in achieving health and sustainability in food systems. I think there's one place that I feel at least is coming up more than others, and that is Mexico. I would say that you are doing so much and so interesting work in terms of how we actually are shifting towards a healthy and sustainable diet. So I'm really excited about being here and also seeing all of you here in the room. I will end with just another personal reflection. But I think as we are looking into the future, we tend to see all these scares on the horizon. But we also need to think about what is actually a good Anthropocene. Where are we heading into a system that can be both more desirable and more attractive than where we are right now? If you're on a bike and you start looking at a pole that is in the way of you, in front of you, you start steering towards that pole. And I think you're at risk of hitting that. And if we're only looking at a disastrous future, we also have a likelihood to sort of go towards that disastrous future. So I think it's really important we start to imagine what does a good food future look like. In that work, we've done some work with culinary actors and chefs. And I was on a panel just the other week with the Swedish Chef of the Year. This is kind of the most celebrated chef in Sweden right now. The first woman to win this competition in the last 20 years or so in Sweden. And she got the question of what would she serve if she was serving kind of a dish that could be this like good and healthy and sustainable dish. You know what she answered? She would serve tacos. And I think that, and she had it for many reasons, because this was a way to get lots of vegetables into the dish. It was also a reason to get a lot of options and different choices onto the table. And the final reason was that this was also a reason why you could get a community around the table and enjoy a meal together. And I think also sometimes we tend to focus on the calories and nutrition, the environmental parts of the food system, but we also need to think about how food builds community and culture. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Line. Very nice comment. And so now we have not too much time, a little bit more than 5 minutes for questions or comments. Please don't be shy. You have, the commissioners here. If you have any question, there is never a bad question. So particularly to our students, don't feel shy. You can ask in Spanish if you want. Yes, Juan Carlos. Yes, please come close to the. You can use the
Hi, my name is Juan Carlos, and I work here. And it's only to know your thoughts. Like, it seems it's clear it's a global problem. But my understanding is like it's a problem. Like, probably the largest contribution is from high-income countries. So my question is if there is any study that shows like if high-income countries change their diet, like probably they are not, like, I don't know if they represent 50% of population, probably it's lower. If high-income countries change their diet, is possible to reach this, to be within these boundaries like faster? So that's my question.
Great. So maybe, I don't know if Johan or Walter would like to answer.
Certainly, from a justice standpoint, the responsibility should be on the high-income countries to change the most and the fastest, very analogous to the use of fossil fuels. I mean, the high-income countries basically burn most of the fossil fuels and created the problem, a key part of the problem we have now. So the changes should logically and in a fair way be the greatest and the fastest in the high-income countries. But the reality is that won't be enough. I think most countries have to be involved in this. That red meat consumption in China is just about equal to the United States now. In Brazil, it's about equal. Mexico's, I'm hearing, is pretty close, actually. So I think everybody is going to suffer. And unfortunately, unfairly, the lowest income countries will suffer the most if we don't make these changes. So pretty much every country, from an environmental standpoint, needs to be involved. But also I think from the health standpoint, hopefully the unfortunate health consequences that have emerged in the high-income countries could be avoided. We much better prevent those in the low and middle-income countries that are transitioning toward diets that are closer to the industrialized, affluent countries. So it's hard to think of a country that wouldn't be involved. I've spent a good bit of my career in Tanzania, and in the urban areas in particular, obesity and diabetes are already major conditions there. And I think it's fair to point out that I use red meat as an example, but a lot of the benefit of adopting the planetary health diet comes from increasing consumption of health-promoting foods like fruits, nuts, legumes. And a lot of this, again, is limiting the loss of healthy transitions. As Juan has described very clearly, the traditional Mexican diet actually is pretty close to the planetary health diet, but already a lot of that has been lost, and recovering that and making it I think one of the most important things to do in a place like Mexico in this area is to elevate the importance of the traditional healthy Mexican diet. It's not that it has to be reinvented, and to give it respect and make it something that people aspire to. And of course, make it practical and convenience everything we're talking about. But again, every country will have a different pathway, but in many countries, it's preserving the traditional positive aspects of nutrition.
Shakuntala wants to add something, but can we just have the question that Bernardo Hernandez, because maybe it's related? No, well, why don't you ask the question, and then I can ask Shakuntala, maybe she would like to answer both questions.
No, thank you, and thanks everybody for joining us. It's really an honor to have you here. We were commenting with Dr. Barquera that you set the bar really high for the rest of the institute for these welcome sessions with the students. And well, my question is, like, taking advantage that you have a lot of students in the room, what are the main gaps in terms of research and in terms of practice? What are we going to have to do in terms of new things that we don't know and we have to know, or new things to have to be done to get better results in planetary health?
So I will have Shakuntala first.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Jan. Let me give an example of a bit of context to what you said, and again, as to how youth and students can get engaged. First of all, as Walter mentioned, there are great disparities in middle and low income countries among the populations, and those disparities are getting higher. So when you talk about rich countries and the wealthy consuming more and contributing more towards unsustainable and unhealthy food systems, then that has to be considered in terms of how the progression that's happening in other countries as well. And that's where also you have large populations. I mean, take a country like India with a very large population. With respect to the point you made about how, and I'm expanding now to how can you get engaged. Within the Food Systems Summit and moving forward, one of the areas that has been brought up is how do you use new technologies and new methods, new approaches, which many of you, the youth, are engaged in. But with respect to sustainable and healthy diets and transformation of food systems, that it's important also to include traditional knowledge and traditional practices. In many countries, or in all countries, traditional knowledge and traditional practices can be a positive towards sustainable, healthy diets. However, this body of work and evidence, it's not like the same as in new technologies, new approaches, using digital technologies. These are in local languages. These are in the form of stories. So I put a challenge to you. How can you combine the use of new technologies and bring in the importance and the advantages that come in with combining with traditional and traditional knowledge and practices?
Thank you. So anybody would like to answer the question posed by our academic dean about research gaps? And then Simon will have the last question.
Yeah, yes. I think that's a good question. And I find it helpful to think about this sector by sector. First of all, we have a lot of knowledge about what a healthy diet is. We know much more than we did 20 or 30 years ago. So we know a lot about where we need to go. And we know much less well about how to get there. And I think, well, this was mentioned already, Mexico has been a leader in some of these aspects, like the soda tax. And looking at the process of getting that, implementing that, and then documenting and monitoring the consequences of that has been really important. You could take that same kind of approach to almost any aspect of diet, including the whole dietary pattern. But then I find it helpful to think of school, again, sector by sector. The schools, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. Finding the best way to implement healthy and sustainable diets in schools. There's the cost issues, analyzing that. The healthcare sector has been almost missing in action in this. That, when was the last time your doctor asked you about what you're eating? My doctor never did. And that's pretty important. And there can be feedback too, again, about healthfulness and weaving in the sustainability to work sites. Again, a big area there of how to implement healthy and sustainable diets, and documenting, describing, and publishing. All those things are really important to not just do it and do good stuff, but actually to document it and publish it so other people can learn from those experiences. The whole food environment issues, again, taxation policy, economic levers, all those things are really important research topics. But again, the dietary assessment, monitoring what happens in reality as the consequences, all of this is important. Working with the agriculture sector is really important as well, that we haven't done as much as we might there. And how to produce healthy and sustainable foods is, there's a lot to be learned there because it's so context specific. So that may be getting a little bit out of the direct public health part of it, but actually we need to strengthen those links with the agriculture community. I find many of my colleagues in the agriculture community are sort of oblivious to this whole area, and working together can really be important for that reason.
Cristina, you want to add something? Yes.
I think just adding to what Walt said, the importance of speaking across sectors as well. I think if in your asking your questions, they may be firmly rooted in public health or nutrition, but speak to other disciplines, speak to economists, speak to sociologists, to ecologists, because it's often in those spaces between disciplines that really innovative ideas that neither one of you on your own would have thought about, and that there may lie some of the new solutions.
Simon, can you make your comment or question?
No, thank you. I also want to thank, I think we are very lucky because today is the welcome seminar for the 4 graduate programs in nutrition in the Institute. So what a better way to start. And I would like to ask you if you are going to discuss explicitly in this new version of the EAT-Lancet, the ultra-processed food contribution, because I think this is an example of something that is affecting a lot with the plastic pollution, fuel pollution, and also with very bad diets. And I think the focus has been more like on what we should eat, but what happened is, are you approaching this problem in the new review?
No, again, Walter, you want to answer or?
Yeah, well, clearly this issue of all this massive amount of unhealthy foods that's being promoted that has a lot of usual calories, refined starches, and sugar are very unhealthy. And of course, there's a lot of profit in producing those. So there's clear detrimental effects of a lot of those. We have been looking at this in our own studies, and it's a little more complicated. That a lot of the foods that fall into the categories that are currently used for defining ultra-processed are actually healthy foods that are whole grains, a lot of whole grain breads, whole grain breakfast cereals, for example, fall into that formal definition, but are actually things that are not unhealthy, that actually look positive in terms of their health benefits. So I think one thing is to be a little careful about the focus. I think the massive amount of what you're describing is a huge problem, and that needs to be again part of what we're describing as a whole healthy dietary pattern. Those are not part of the healthy dietary pattern that we need to be promoting in all of these places: schools, healthcare systems, work sites. So the issue, and especially of sugar-sweetened beverage and processed meats, those come out every time we look at it as really the biggest parts of this problem. But that's certainly not limited to those foods.
Thank you very much. Well, so unfortunately, we have to end at this point. Thank you very much to the commissioners. It was really a great seminar. And muchas gracias a alumnos y a los profesores por haber participado. Muchísimas gracias a todos.